Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar on comic strip conversations, a strategy that we can use to help the social understanding for our autistic students. My details are on the slide below and also our Twitter account and the Send Success website. Send Success is an outreach service that is commissioned by the London Borough of Waltham Forest. The two outcomes of this training are that you should be able to use this strategy straight away with some of your students, and also the second part of this is that your students will become trained up themselves in learning to use this activity. And I have experienced situations where children have almost started the comic strip conversation without me because they've become so engaged with this tool. Now, a little bit of a reminder that autism is a spectrum and not all children will enjoy this strategy. So it is always a trial and error with children with autism, and just like you've done with social stories and other ways of helping children understand their world, this may work or it may not work. So be mindful of that as you go forward. So by the end of the session, the end of this webinar, you should be able to answer these 5 questions. So who developed the concept? Why does it suit autistic students? Almost, why does it suit their autistic minds? What are the advantages? What equipment do you need? And what is the format 4-step? So by the end of the session, you should be able to answer those 5 questions. So Carol Gray is the creator of social stories, and I'm sure you've all heard of social stories, but she's also the creator of the comic strip conversation, and this is her comic strip conversation book, which you can get on Amazon or any other retailer, but it's really worth purchasing, as is her social stories book. I think the difference between a social story and a comic strip conversation, a social story is often about something that is going to happen. So preparation to go to assembly, or preparation to go on a school trip, or preparation for children returning to the classroom on March the 8th, whatever it be. Comic strip conversations tend to be used post an event. So if there has been an incident on the playground, we often use the comic strip conversation to work out what was happening. What were people thinking? What were people saying? What were people doing? So there is quite a difference in what we're doing here. So one of the strategies that helps young people with autism understand their social world is comic strip conversations, along with other things like social stories. But the comic strip conversation will help them make sense of their social world. Now, children with autism think differently, and they have different ways of seeing the world. By filling in some of the social gaps where they might not realise that people think differently to them or feel differently to them, or there is inference to a situation, that they begin to understand what is going on. And if you can make sense of your world, then it has a significant impact on your well-being and your mental health. And we all know that as children with autism get older, there is a higher incident rate of mental health compared to their neurotypical peers. The other thing is that children with autism, because their world is uncertain and they see things in a certain way, that they have what we call inflexible thoughts or rigid beliefs. And this is a way of helping them to see another viewpoint. And if you think about one of our employability skills, our work skills, it's absolutely to be able to understand that other people think differently and that they have an opinion. So there is a social skills element in helping them understand the social world that they live in. Now, if you have children with social communication difficulties or behavioural challenges, children that are getting themselves into difficult situations at school, this strategy can also be used for them. It's not solely for children with autism. You can use it as you want, as you feel might work. And again, it's that trial and error situation that we talk about all the time when we work with children with SEN. And that includes SEMH children. So if this strategy works, then go with it. So this is a fairly common situation in a classroom. So the picture is of a young person in the middle. Let's call him Thomas, and Thomas has an ADHD and an autism profile. And the reason I've attached the ADHD is because often that impulsivity and that behaviour often come together. So here's Thomas in the middle, and he knows the answer, and he's calling out, and he's not waiting for the teacher to ask him for his answer. And what he won't know is what others are thinking in that current situation. Now, he also has probably made a prediction that the teacher wants to hear his answer. So there's a lot of thought processes that need to be unravelled here. Now, I had this very situation with a year 10 student. He was in mainstream, he was very bright, and he had that profile of autism and ADHD. And he was renowned for just calling out answers. And as the children got older, so as he sort of hit year 10, he began to be bullied, and we managed it as best we could. One of the problems when I spoke to the children was they talked about, the young people said, he just dominates the class, we don't get a chance to answer, we don't. So I took this young person aside and did a comic strip narrative with him, and we had a look at what was going on in the classroom. And for me, it was a bit of a revelation, because we sat down and I drew out the stick man and I put him in the middle, and calling out, it was science, where there was a lot of hostility towards this young person, and we were struggling to manage it. And of course, he was just calling out. He was good at science and he just called out. So we unpicked it a little bit. And when I asked him to think about what the other children, what the other young people in the classroom may think when he calls out the answer and he hasn't waited for the teacher to request the answer from him, he looked quite blankly at me and he really didn't know the answer. So I was able to fill in some of the thought bubbles. And they were things like, you know, he's such a show-off. I wish he would stop. Every lesson he does this. I never get a chance to answer. I wish the teacher would do something about it. And then those are the thoughts. And then we started talking about the feelings of those young people. And of course, this is where some of the hostility was coming from, and the bullying was coming from, because a lot of the young people were beginning to express their emotions. They were fed up with him constantly interrupting their lessons. And I remember him just sitting with wide eyes and a dropped mouth when I said to him, this is what they're thinking. Now, he had no idea. It had the biggest impact on his behaviour, because we were able to make some suggestions. We rehearsed the hands up, and we rehearsed the waiting for the signal, and we gave him question and answer cards, so he got at least 3 chances to answer a question, and it improved. And I worked with the class, and the behaviour of the class improved. So it can be really powerful, particularly for you as a professional, because you suddenly realise where the gaps are in perhaps some of their social understanding. So this little visual is just to remind you that children with autism will often gravitate to adults. And the reason they gravitate to adults is because we are accommodating in how we respond, because we understand that children with autism might not realise that we want to talk endlessly about bus timetables or whatever it be. But because we understand the situation, we will manage to listen to their conversations despite thinking, my goodness me, I'd like to go to the staff room for a coffee break. When the children have conversations with their peers about bus timetables or whatever their specialist interest is, often they get a negative response. And I just want to remind you that this is an example of how children misunderstand the person they are talking to. They think, I'm really interested in bus timetables, and their concrete, literal response and thinking is, if I'm interested, then so must you be. So this is some of the classic behavioural things that you see in a classroom. And I just wanted to use that little example because I'm sure we've all of us experienced the autistic child chatting to us endlessly about something. So I wanted to use this example as a misunderstanding that we all experience even though we are not autistic. So we all have a mobile phone, and we often ring people and we might get the reject button or the decline button. And when that happens, we are able to go, usually, when we receive a decline, or that person may be busy, they might be in a work meeting, or that person might be bathing their child, or that person might be paying the bill in a shop. So we are able to layer those thoughts. But we also struggle because sometimes it might be our partner and he or she is supposed to be home and they haven't been home on time for the last few nights. So you can sense the anxiety, and what does reject mean, and why aren't they answering? And I use this example because I want people to understand that we also struggle with those social layers of understanding, and then we make predictions. And we come home, and our partner comes home, and we give him a rocket and say, "Where have you been? I rang you, you declined 3, 4, 5 times." So we also have that anxiety around human behaviour and predictability and uncertainty, and according to the situation that might change. I did have a child, he was 17, 18, and he was struggling with his friends rejecting his phone calls. And of course, they were all legitimate phone call rejections. They were happening once or twice, and I was talking to my mum about my homework, I was getting on a bus, I couldn't answer my phone, I might have tripped. And once we unravelled this situation for him, he had a really catastrophic response. He said, if my friends decline my phone call, then they don't want to be my friends. And that is a very catastrophic response. And again, catastrophic thinking is something that autistic children can do. But by using the comic strip, I was able to explain to him that they might be doing other things, and that's okay. So now we're going to have a look at the strategy, comic strip conversations, and it's basically a combination of stick figures and conversation symbols to explain a situation. The difference being a social story, you might draw it up on the computer, add some photos, etc., and then present it to the child and read through it. In this situation, we do it with the student. So the next part of the webinar is how to write a comic strip conversation, and we need to put a couple of things in place before we start. So we need to be able to, with the young person, to do some preparation, and we need to check their understanding of the thought bubble, the speech bubble, and obviously the stick people. And my advice to you is just do this preparation and perhaps draw a very simple comic strip conversation with just think of something that they're doing really well. So you can put 2 people and there's the speech bubble and it would be the teacher saying, "You're sitting really well for maths, well done." And then you could do a thought bubble, and the child would say, "Well, I was really pleased that you saw me doing this." But you need to make sure they understand it. The other thing I would say to you is that you don't have to be an artist to do these diagrams. We use stick people, we use speech bubbles and thought bubbles. And I've had to draw buses, dogs, bicycles, you name it, dining room hatches. I am not an artist. So please don't worry. And actually what happens is the young people quite enjoy your terrible drawings. And that's where you say, "Can you draw me a dog? Because I'm used to drawing dogs." And they'll have a go and they'll laugh. So I think because it is a collaborative strategy, don't worry about the drawings. Just my final point before we move on is that the thought bubble is also what the person is thinking, so the language that they are thinking, but you may want to do a thought bubble around what that person is feeling. So if we go back to the last example of the child calling out and the other children are thinking, "I would like a go. I would like to have an answer question." So that's what they are thinking. Those are the words. And then you could do another speech bubble coming from that speech bubble that says something like, "I'm really angry with him. He's making me really fed up." So it's, again, really important that children with autism understand those layers of thinking, that from the thoughts comes an emotion. In addition, if you want to, you can use the colours that match up to emotional regulation, and I often do this. So people used to laugh at me. I used to carry a whiteboard and 4 coloured pens, and they were these colours. So, red was the things that weren't great and that needed, and actions that weren't great, behaviours. Green was all the good things that you could see and any good actions, and I'd always write the green suggestion behaviour in there, and then blue, any sort of emotional sort of frustrations, uncomfortable. And then black I would use for facts and truth. But again, none of this is necessary, but I used to do it. If I had a bit more time and I had the colours available, then I would, particularly the red and the green zone, because I've worked in many schools where we talk about, the red zone and trying to stay out of the red zone and being green. So I'm sure some of you have heard of those things. So this is a little worksheet that you can use for the children to teach them other ways of using the speech bubbles and thought bubbles. And you can just do like number one person listening, which one is it? And they can have a go at perhaps writing something in the speech bubble, listening as part of a group. I like number 4, which is loud and quiet. So you can use capital letters to indicate that somebody is shouting or talking loudly, and then lowercase perhaps to indicate that they're talking quietly. So again, you develop your symbols that work for your children. So it's that personalisation of this strategy. So this is a comic strip board. I would remove the word story, but it's up to you. But you can have these pre-made. I used to do them on A3, so they were really big, so you could get your drawings done. And I would have up to 8 squares, and then a bit at the bottom for writing the conclusion, the summary and the conclusion. So we're now at the stage where we're going to put a comic strip conversation together. This is an example of the first 2 boxes. It is not a complete story. So the opening box is the scenario, the situation. So what happened, or what was the first thing that happened before the problem? So they're in the playground. This is James, stick man on his own. He wants to join the group of children, and we get the child in and we say, we're going to have a chat and we're going to talk about what happened. A bit of reassurance, you're not in trouble. I'm going to draw it out. Sometimes works to say something like, I'm going to draw it out, and this helps me understand. But again, reassuring them that they're going to learn perhaps to make some changes to their behaviour, but there's not a sanction, all right? We're not going to call home or whatever it be. And that's about reassurance. So this is an example of step 1. Step 1 in the format is to describe the scenario, the situation before the problem. So James is in the playground. If you want to personalise it, you can. If James was wearing a cap, or the children were standing by the gate in the playground, whatever it be, make it personal to him and try and use language that he gives you or you use to indicate certain things. So I asked him what happened, and he said they were all talking in the playground, and who's they? Well, it's Susan and Tim or whoever. And then what did you say? I didn't say anything, but I was thinking, thinking all the kids are standing there and I want to talk with them. So that's what I wrote in the speech bubble, in the thought bubble. That was the situation before the problem arose. The next box indicates the problem, the situation that happened. So he goes over to the group, he interrupts and says something like, I'm wearing Star Wars underpants, which of course that invokes various behaviours from other children. So in this example, thought bubbles are drawn. Now again, I must remind you that when you write a thought bubble, it might be what the child is thinking, but it also should indicate what the child is feeling. So it could say something like, I am sad that James has interrupted, or I feel embarrassed that he's talking about underpants, or I wish she would go away, or something like that. So there's thoughts and feelings, and those are opportunities to make a note of that. Now, if you ask James, what do you think Susan thinks about when you talk about wearing underpants? He'll probably say something like, I don't know, or she thinks it's funny, and Susan may think it's funny, or she might be embarrassed. So if he doesn't have an idea, you're going to have to give it to him, and it is best to say something like, Susan would feel embarrassed, so you might put, I feel embarrassed in the bubble, or in the thought bubble, whatever it be. And as it says here, I wish she wouldn't talk about underpants, I don't know what to say now, and I don't like it when Jim interrupts. The final part of a comic strip is some behaviour checks, some suggestions to change things and to improve things. And this few sentences, you probably wouldn't write this many sentences, but I just wanted to give you some examples. So if he continually talked about underpants in all different situations, then you would say, remember, talking about underpants makes some people feel embarrassed, and you give a suggestion of a different behaviour. And then there's the other one, remember, joining in a conversation, we need to listen to the topic and see if we can say something related to this. Remember to wait for a gap to speak so we don't interrupt. So there's not a negative connotation there, and it's not sort of saying you have done wrong, but it's about making suggestions. So that's the opening to a comic strip. The scenario, and try and personalise it, and that opening slide is you're trying to engage with the child, a bit of humour, a bit of fun, a bit of personalisation, and then you start unpicking what happened. It might take several boxes to unpick some of the behaviours and for him to understand, and you may have to overread it again and go back across it for it to be worthwhile. So this is the 4 steps, and I've explained to you step 1 and then the next step, so how it all started, the situation. Step 2 is target the topic, the problem, what happened, and then 3 is the summary of the conversation, and then 4 is the conclusion. So I'll go on to show you some more practical examples, but it's really important that you don't just do a situation, the problem, and you have to finish it off with the conclusion and the good advice. Notice we use the language good advice. I think it's really important that we understand when children misunderstand social situations, that is part of their spectrum and their difficulties, and that if we start handing out sanctions and making it a negative environment, we're not going to develop any understanding or learning. So this really is a strategy to support new behaviour, new ideas. So this is a little example, and you can see here that someone has just hand drawn this. They've added a bit of hair, but this is the 4 steps in terms of writing a good comic strip conversation. And here we are, I've just abbreviated them: situation, problem, summary, conclusion. The visual is 1 and 2, and then the writing at the bottom is the summary and conclusion. So this is about a misunderstanding of a child being called kid instead of their name. And I think we all know how important our own names are, but when you're autistic, your name is incredibly important to you and how you are referred to. So it starts with, I think I'll ask that kid if he wants to play. Hey kid, do you want to play? He called me kid. He doesn't like me. Don't call me kid. So there's a misunderstanding because he doesn't know his name. He uses the word kid. Then it deteriorates. Why is he kicking me? I just wanted to play with him. Ouch. I'm not a kid. Don't call me kid. So it ended up in a misunderstanding around being called a kid, and the autistic child didn't like that, and then the other kids started kicking him. Oh, so the autistic child did. So here is the summary. Tom called me kid because he didn't know my name but wanted to play with me. Right? That's the summary of the situation. And the next time Tom or someone calls me kid, so here's the advice, the conclusion, I'll tell them my name and that I don't like to be called kid. Here comes some good advice. I'll apologise to Tom and tell him my name is AJ, and I will also tell him that I don't like being called kid and please don't call me that again. So there's a really nice message in there. And if your child doesn't read well, you can do some little visuals and sort of you can continue the visuals instead of putting it in script with some perhaps labels of sorry or whatever, something slightly easier to manage. But just again, situation, problem, summarize, conclusion. Those are the 4 steps of a comic strip conversation. So this is a comic strip conversation that I do with children, and you can go onto YouTube and find the link for it's an EastEnders sketch where Denise brings a young child to the park. Anyway, I used it as a strategy so that children could write a comic strip conversation, draw it up, and practice it without in any way feeling threatened. So this is just a different strategy if you wanted to do this strategy with children and teach it to them almost third person, so it's not directly linked to them. So problem, Denise is at the park with her granddaughter. She's thinking, I'm happy today. The child's thinking, I'm hungry. And then a dog comes over and licks the child's face. And Denise thinks, I feel scared. What does she do? She says, get away, and shoos the dog away. And the child thinks, ugh, yucky dog. And then Denise uses her bag to push the dog away, and the dog falls in the pond. And somebody comes running across the grass because what they see is Denise very, very upset and angry, pushing this dog into a pond, and the person thinks Denise needs help and runs across the park. So this is a way of explaining, because EastEnders is full, like many soaps, full of inference, so that a scenario will happen and you have to kind of guess why that's happened. So we see on the screen this young person running across trying to help Denise, who's very angry and has shoved this dog in the pond. So it's just about using this strategy to help children understand. EastEnders is brilliant because you can do things, and Emmerdale is turn the sound down. So then you can have that opportunity to get children to look at emotions and faces as well as actions of people. And so you have a much bigger conversation around what's going on. And then here comes the last bit, the summary and the conclusion. The tailors need to put their dog on the lead in the park, and then everyone will feel safe. And there's that person thinking, I'm happy walking. So that's another example of using a comic strip conversation in a slightly different way. So these are 2 scenarios, and these are after the session is finished, you could do one of these scenarios where you draw out one of these scenarios in a comic strip. So Robert calls out in lessons and other students are getting upset with him and calling him names. And so I would get you to use your boxes and draw this out following the 4-step format. Or the other one is, and this is again is a classic, where the autistic child will often disturb a game of football and walk across a basketball pitch or take the ball or whatever, or pretend they're a train going through the traffic or whatever they're doing. So these 2 scenarios at the end of the session you can have a go at, perhaps particularly the calling out in lessons is a good one to do, and you can have a go at just drawing out the boxes, and then what do people think and what are people saying, what are people doing, and then some good advice at the end, a summary of conversation and then some good advice. So I just want to look at finally some tips about how to get things done and done really well. This is important, that we when we run a new strategy, that we've done the preparation with the child, but also that the child is in a good place. So if the incident has just happened and they've been kicked in the playground and they're still highly upset, or even when they're calming down a little bit, you should wait a bit longer. And you might say to them, there's been an incident on the playground, it's okay, we're going to talk about the incident on the playground tomorrow, is that okay? So you wait till they're calm. And you reassure them. ensure you have a quiet space. I mean, some of these things are fairly obvious. I've explained to you how you can create a third-person explanation by depersonalising it. Follow the 4-point format. Remember what the 4-point format is. It's the situation, it's the problem, it's the summary of what was said and perhaps done, and then the last bit, the conclusion and some good advice. Once you've done the social story, the next point I would say to you is that you keep your comic strip. I keep calling them social stories. You'll keep your comic strip conversations. Keep them in a book, keep them in a folder, return to them if you want to. The other thing you can do is you can do comic strip conversations about things that worked, that went okay, so that you don't always use this scenario, this strategy when it's a negative situation. So for example, if they go to assembly and they put their hand up and they answer a question in assembly, which is the exact format that you should be following and that you've been hoping that they would, and teaching them to do that, you could do a comic strip conversation. It would be a really positive thing to do, because if it's all around changing behaviour and it's negative, they might not want to return to it. So remember, when a child has success at something, they're more likely to return to that conversation. Good practice, if you are going to embed this within your strategies, that you have a common ground for the symbols, and especially if another member of staff decides to do this strategy with that child. Print out some grids. You've seen some copies of some grids. Absolutely have them to hand. So I think one of the 4 or 5 questions I posed to you at the beginning of the session was about advantages, and I think without me putting things up, you're probably already beginning to see the advantages, but just have a quick look through. Ease anxiety. Remember that children with autism struggle to socially predict what's going to happen. They struggle to understand that other people think differently to them, have different emotions to them. So it's really important that we remember that if we explain the social event in a visual way, it will ease anxiety. In turn, we hope that it would improve behaviours and less incidents, or that they might be able to generalise what we're teaching them. It's a really simple strategy that we can teach our staff and our families, and more so that students are engaged, involved, part of the strategy, and they can use it. And as I said, I've given you examples where students have already started a comic strip of what's happened to them. And this is a big E for me. It's about learning more about your child, but also it's learning more about what actually happened. It's very easy to be judgmental or jump to conclusions when actually you suddenly realise that the child that disturbed the football game wasn't in the middle of the pitch, as one of the kids had said, but was at the side. And so because you can draw out the football pitch and put them in the right place. And I think it's really important that we help children explain what happened in a visual way. This is a big advantage, that it requires no resources. If you wanted to buy the book, brilliant. If you didn't, but pen and paper you can use. Cheap, yeah, it's absolutely cheap. So to conclude, these are the 5 questions that I posed at the beginning of the webinar. I'm not going to go through them all, but I'm hoping that at the end of this session that you have been able to answer these questions. Sense Success run social stories and comic strip conversation training, which is where we spend a little bit more time looking at the detail of those strategies. So please look out on our website for further training. Thank you.